I moved from the gravel desert of Rajasthan, India, to a similar one in Oman when I was 5 years old. Then I had just a few blurred memories of Rajasthan and none of the land I was born in, Australia. My first visions of home were the startling blue skies that belonged to Oman alone, the dry, scorching heat, the undulating dun landscape, twisting acacia trees, carved and painted metal doors, watchtowers pluming the hills, the sea in every imaginable shade of blue, and the ancient, soaring, gentle, giant mountains, which change colors and personalities throughout the day. Maps identify Oman broadly as a desert, but that description belies the fact that the Omani landscape is composed of a gravel desert, salt banks, desert woodlands, and what one would call a proper desert. Growing up with a botanist mother, I also learned to see the gardens inside the desert, a reminder that was as alive and lively an environment as, as any other. It was just that the theater of life in the desert was a more nuanced, delicate affair. If you peered closer into the seemingly bare hills and wadi beds, you could spot a garden growing in memory of a months old flash wadi. If you turned over a rock, you would find a cool, hidden world vibrating below. And finally, if you looked at the rocks themselves, you would see the reminders of the seabed they were once part of millions of years ago. When I was 8 years old, I developed a mania for collecting rocks. Beyond watching TV, a weekly Hindi film, Arabic cartoons, and English shows, I whiled my time away reading, writing short stories, uh, inspired by my favorite books, and filling one sketchbook after another with watercolors. When I read Daryl Durrell's My Family and Other Animals, I also decided to start keeping a nature journal in imitation of the boy Gerald. I first tried bird watching, but gave that up pretty soon, too impatient and restless to cultivate the discipline of identifying, following, and contemplating a bird. I then decided to try identifying plants, accompanying my mother on seed collecting expeditions for a paper she was working on, lugging along a desert plant guidebook to identify the flora. However, I was too young to pay attention to the almost invisible gardens adorning the desert around me. I yearned for the obvious ones, which grew in the aftermath of rain, which, however, occurred only twice or thrice a year in Oman. The plant obsession arrived and vanished from my life as swiftly as post-rain desert blooms. And so rocks became my refuge, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you consider Oman's landscape. If you Google Oman and geology, you'll see a link superlatively describing it as a geological paradise. Paradise truly being an apt word, given that it's derived from the Persian word for walled garden. Oman, in that sense, is indeed a fantastical and gorgeous garden of rocks, a geologically fecund landscape pulsating with rock stories. The closer and longer I gazed at the landscape, the more rocks began to reveal themselves to me in startling, rewarding ways. I grew up on a university campus encircled by mountains and built upon a hilly landscape. When I awakened in the morning, the first thing I saw were apricot tinted mauve mountains in the distance. They changed color and texture all throughout the day, and I could never decide whether they looked their most beautiful during dawn or dusk. When I began exploring the hills, studying the campus, I started to encounter so many interesting and diverse looking rocks that it seemed natural to bring them back home. I felt as if I'd giddily ventured inside a geological bakery where the rocks appeared to be identical cookies and cakes, only to reveal a new flavor and texture and story in each. There were only so many that I could take with me in one go, though, which meant there were always more waiting to find me when I returned. Unlike birds which swiftly vanished at the slightest sound of your presence, or irritatingly evanescent post-rain plants, the rocks were always there. While at first I was casual about which rocks I picked up, I soon spent hours minutely examining and sorting through them, as if I was shopping for fruits or vegetables at a grocery store, before finally selecting which ones I would take back home. I would carry a rock, even if it was heavy, simply because of how striking it looked, unwilling to leave such a treasure behind. What if I could not locate it the next time I came to the spot? Perhaps it was an almost perfect oblong shape, ancient leaf or shell fossils enameling a smooth gray surface, or a chunkier one marked by numerous striated layers, each brilliantly distinct from the others. Sometimes I would be curious to see the original hues of a dust enveloped rock, and so that too would merit it coming home with me. I would then sluice water across it, witnessing an antique painting coming back to life, and revealing its original shades and nuances. Many rocks were firmly lodged in the soil, and when I could finally pry them out, it was almost as I was uprooting a tooth or a plant. I do not recollect whether I felt any guilt at doing so. In my singular passion and child's self absorption, I simply felt that I was entitled to pick up whatever rock took my fancy. Although I ascribed feelings to other inanimate objects such as my dolls or teddy bears, rocks clearly were just rocks. If the front yard was a repository of my mother's large, lovingly tended collection of plants, I annexed a spot in the backyard to store my burgeoning rock collection. Given that I collected the rocks from the hills dotting the university campus, it was fitting enough that I had created an Ezard's Hill of beige, dun, brown, gray, rust, and deep red, an alternative home for the rocks. However, if I ever needed to find a specific rock, I would have to carefully pull it out, lest the hill disintegrate altogether. On the whole, though, the rocks remained where they were, a visual memorial to my collecting habits. I arranged my most prized rock finds on my bedroom desk, where they shared space with other current precious possessions. A limited edition rainbow-haired troll, a plastic pyramid paperweight filled with purple ivory pearls and shells. I remember the rock I was most proud of having found, a sliced geode, a hollow, vaguely spherical rock containing masses of minerals, whose insides were covered in radiant diaphanous crystals, truly a gift from the geological gods. My interest in the rocks gradually became more academic the older I grew. When I turned 10 years old, I started frequenting my school library's natural history section, determined to thoroughly educate myself about rocks beyond their aesthetics and textures. What essentially and honestly fascinated me about rocks at that time was that they were just so old. They were pieces of history just as much as the artifacts found in an ancient Egyptian pyramid, another childhood obsession. Whether it was a rock or a gold tumbler one held in hand, these objects spoke of places and people and situations far, far away in the annals of time. And that notion was unbearably exciting for me. When I held a rock, weighing the heft of Earth's natural history, it was like holding a conch shell to my ear and seemingly hearing the sea swirling within this world walls. I was being permitted to hear and bear witness to a past beyond my scope of understanding appreciation. And as it happened, given that so many of the rocks I found in Oman had once sat at the bottom of the sea, it would not be so inaccurate to say that I could hear the sea in them too. I started compiling and presenting my finds in the form of rock reports. Each consisted of a watercolor or colored pencil rendering of the rock, accompanied by a detailed description of its appearance, its mineral composition, its geological story, and the location in which it was found. I drew the intact, distinct layers of a textbook sedimentary rock, describing it as a rock layer cake. I faithfully tried to reproduce the long silenced ferns and shells on the rock. I painstakingly tried to render the exact shades of browns and reds, working on them for hours. Perhaps if I had been collecting rocks today, I would have blogged about or Instagrammed them. But in those dinosaur days, I used whatever spare paper I found. One of my proudest moments occurred when a university professor, an expert in Omani geology, invited me to present the reports and talk to a few of his students, generously acknowledging and encouraging the sheer enthusiasm I nurtured for rocks. In those days, when someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I did not hesitate to say a geologist. And then just like that, I stopped. The more I grew into my adolescence, the less interested I became in the ancient stones around me. Whereas earlier, I would have been able to identify them by type and age, they soon became mere rocks again in my increasingly uninterested eyes. I no longer went on rock collecting expeditions or wrote reports. And as for the pyramid of rocks, it gradually diminished until there was nothing left of it. The funny thing is that while I distinctly recollect when and where I collected the rocks, I've entirely forgotten how I got rid of them. My guess is that they eventually found their way into the surrounding hills once more, back to where they ultimately and rightly belonged. Now, with the gift of hindsight, I'd wish I thought to keep at least one specimen, and time portal in this case, of that period of my life and of Oman itself. Thank you so much.